Want to expand the reach of your content? Start a podcast. Feature industry experts on your show and leverage the influence and reach of your guests to grow your brand. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the Behind the Curtain series of B2B Growth. I'm really pumped to be back into a somewhat regular rhythm of doing these with Logan Lyles, our Director of Partnerships, and my dear friend. Logan, how you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic, dude. I'm excited to see you next week, but I'm also excited that we're back in the rhythm of doing these episodes and sharing with people the lessons we're learning as we're building our own business here, man.
Yeah, it's super fun. And Logan, today we're going to be talking about the math of sales. This is something that we have recently figured out for ourselves and something that I have been learning from Rex Biberston and the guys over at the Sales Developers. I see them talk about it a lot. And so decided to try to figure what that is for us. And because of all the data that you've been collecting the last probably 6 to 8 months, really being diligent in our CRM and working with different folks on our sales team to get the right data inputted so that you can see the right numbers in front of you, you've really been able to come up with a pretty comprehensive view of what it takes for us to get a deal across the finish line from someone that's a complete stranger that we're doing outbound with. So take it from here. Tell us a little bit about the numbers that you've looked at and really the benefit of knowing your numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start with that second point, and then we'll get into, our specific sales process and the conversion points and the numbers that we looked at specifically. But I think it's important. The first lesson that I really learned here, and I would, advise for other sales leaders, especially if they're at early stage companies like ours, is find a way to understand the conversion points at the different steps in your sales process. When I joined the team a year ago, we didn't really have a defined sales process. We weren't even tracking, how many sales calls are we having? How many interviews are we doing? I mean, you could see how many interviews we're doing with prospective customers in B2B Growth Feed, but it wasn't something that we were actively tracking in the CRM. So I've done some tweaking in what are the deal stages in our CRM. We use HubSpot CRM. A lot of people use Salesforce, and that's a common first step, but really looking at understanding the conversion points from one deal stage or one step in your sales process to the next. So what I started doing was, all right, we've got first sales calls, we've got follow-up sales calls. We're usually initiating with new prospects if it's outbound through interviewing them on B2B Growth. So another, sales activity type are interviews, and then looking at, okay, what outreach does it take to initiate a conversation and an interview with someone that we would like to work with to interview them on the podcast. So that's what I started looking at, is working from the front end of the sales process backwards. So we looked at, okay, we've got email outreach. How many emails do we typically send in order to get a reply and book someone to do an interview with us on our podcast? And then from there, how many of those turn into qualified sales opportunities where there's interest and timing, and we ask that question and they book a follow-up sales call? For other folks, that might be booking a demo or booking a qualification call based on cold outreach or telephone outreach or email or whatever it might be. And then looking at, okay, what is the conversion to close from there? So first, I had to look at what are the stages, what are the steps in our sales process, and then look at the conversion points in between there. So that's really where I started. And then we had to, build different meeting types in our CRM so that I could see, okay, how many have we done, per week, per month here, do some quick math so that I could at least have a baseline of what those conversion numbers were.
Mm. So what were some of those numbers?
Yeah. So when we do email outreach to folks, we were seeing about a 30 to 35% response rate and getting them booked to be a guest on the podcast. And then from there, about half of those, 50%, were turning into qualified sales opportunities where someone was at least interested in having a conversation about our service, either joining one of our collective podcasts or us helping them launch a show, or maybe us helping them, produce a show that they already have. So kind of different opportunities, but usually a 50%,
Which is really high. I mean, I would say for anybody listening, a big part of that is one, Nikki, our primary co-host now, is just phenomenal at this. She does an enormous amount of research on each guest and is looking at the content that they're putting out. And so when she starts that conversation at the end of the interview, seeing if they're interested in possibly having their own show, it's very effective because she puts in a lot of work to make it that effective. There's also, I think, something to the fact that we're interviewing them on a podcast and our service happens to be podcasting. So the correlation of them being on a show and wanting their own show, we probably weed out a lot of the people that just wouldn't be interested in having their own show by the people that don't agree to be a guest on ours. So I was really shocked at that 50% number, that 50% of our guests end up turning into sales conversations with you. So I just wanted to give that caveat. That is probably not a number you should expect if you're selling software or financial services or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There are, two things. It's kind of meta in our situation. And then also, I think, we're very lucky in that the way that Nikki approaches, what we call turning relationships into revenue and doing it in a way that feels natural, that doesn't feel like you're getting a timeshare presentation after a free lunch and those sorts of things. Those are definitely things that you want to think about. I think on the flip side, even though you're not having people on a podcast and then offering them podcast services like we are, you've just had a conversation with someone about high level trends in your industry. So you are more equipped to have a better conversation with them about the challenges that they're facing. So if you are thoughtful and your sales process does include interviewing your prospects on a podcast, think about the questions that you're asking, not only in the content that you create, but how you can understand your buyers better in the challenges they're facing, the solutions they're finding, those sorts of things. I think we get a lot of that by interviewing marketers about, things other than just podcasting as well. So I think that's really good context, James. So moving on from there, I mentioned our email outreach, 30 to 35% between sales calls, and then a 5 to 10% close rate off of, all sales calls that we're having. Now, the next step in the process here that we're kind of dealing with or looking to tackle is to break it down further, because what this allowed us to do here, now that we have these 3 conversion points and these 3 metrics, we can work backwards from a revenue goal. Okay, we know our average deal size is this. Okay, how many deals per month does it take to hit this goal? Okay, then we need to have this many sales calls. Then we need to have this many interviews. Now we need to do this much outreach because we know those conversion points along the way. So that has been a game changer for us, as opposed to just, hey, let's set this goal and let's try and hit it. And let's just work really hard, which our team has been doing a great job at. But now we have better leading indicators, to borrow, a phrase as we went through the 4 disciplines of execution a while back. What are those lead measures that are going to lead to the lag measures that we're trying to achieve?
Just knowing we need to find contact information for VPs of marketing at 700 accounts in a particular industry. So with our new model, with these collective shows we're doing, B2B sales show, industrial manufacturing, crafting culture, these shows that are focused on very specific industries or roles in an organization or categories, we know, okay, we're going to go to 700 companies, knowing that 35% of those people are going to say yes to being on the show, knowing that 50% of those people are going to turn into a sales conversation, knowing that 5 to 10% of those people are going to end up becoming a co-host of one of these shows. So having that number 700 makes equipping our research team that's building these lists for us jobs so much easier, because we know, hey, we need to go find conferences that have, this 700 different sponsors so that we can build lists accordingly, or we need to find lists in some other way, but 700 is your stopping point. And so we're really in the beginning phases of taking it to this level. We haven't done this before. So we might find that with selling collective shows, it takes a little bit more. Maybe it takes 800 or 900, but I'm really excited to dive in and start using this framework that you've allowed us to execute, because to me, it just brings an enormous amount of clarity and focus around what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a couple of things here in the next stage for us, I think you touched on a caveat there. Right now, we're not entirely changing our business model, but we've layered on a new offering in the last 4 to 5 months that is a very much a different go-to-market strategy. It has allowed us to be more account-based, more targeted. We've narrowed in our ICP quite a bit. So one thing I'm keeping my eye on is, as we've offered a new service and we've become more targeted, as opposed to saying, hey, we tend to work with tech companies. We know our buyer persona is a VP of marketing typically. We know that 50 plus employees is kind of a ground level for us typically in that account criteria. Now we're being more targeted. Okay, we're trying to find folks who want to get in front of HR or manufacturing companies. And so we're taking that ICP that's been kind of loose and narrowing it down. And so I think one of the things here, not only for sales, but for marketing, is the more you understand your ICP, the more you can hone in this math of sales. And we're at the beginning stages of it, admittedly, as you point out there, James. But I think that's going to allow us to really test and A/B test different things to see what's really effective. Because the next steps for us here, and I was talking with Rex at the Sales Developers about this, is he was looking at kind of our math of a sale. It was like, well, your conversion point from interview to sales call and sales call to close, but what about the steps between that first sales call and the close? If you deliver a proposal, how does that change your conversion rate? Another thing I'm thinking about is, I've tracked number of sales calls we've had over the last year and number of deals that we've closed. And doing that simple math has given me that 5 to 10% close rate.
Yeah.
But I don't know definitively, okay, if it's outbound, it's 5%. If it's inbound, it's 14%. Those are two different sales motions. A lot of organizations are going to have a mixture of inbound and outbound. Now, they might be different percentages, but most of us are going to have those two sales motions. And I think understanding the percentages on both of those and isolating them a little bit can add a lot of value and, to your point, more clarity. So that's kind of the next step for me, is figuring out these mini steps in the process. What are those conversion points? Because the value there is going to be not only more clarity, but allow us to find, oh, maybe there's a small leak here, and let's test how we do this, or how we follow up after the first sales call, or how we deliver a proposal that could help us, increase a little bit. And something I saw from Ethan Butte at BombBomb the other day is, was very encouraging. Hey, if you increase, 5% here, 5% here, 5% here, 5%, all of a sudden you're at 25%.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like you've made this massive shift, and 25% increase in your sales process feels like, a massive task.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging for this next stage. And then being able to delineate inbound versus outbound so that you can build out your team accordingly. Do you want to go heavier outbound because you see that the economics of that and the input that it takes really works well? Or maybe inbound is just more economical as you understand the math of your sales. So you're going to invest even more in content. So it really educates your approach to building out operations, to building out marketing, and all those sorts of things. Is something a quote that I love, especially, heading up the sales team here at Sweetfish. I was mentioning to Bill, our COO, the other day, nothing happens until someone sells something.
Yep.
Right? And, the idea that, hey, I know what it takes to sell something so that I can plan for these other areas, I think is enormously valuable. And so it's been fun for me to work through this process.
Yeah. The idea of, obviously that Aaron Ross made famous with predictable revenue is just really exciting to me as we start to build out other parts of the organization, and we're hiring people that can help us build audiences for the shows that we're building, and hiring videographers and social media folks and writers. And we can't do any of that stuff because we don't have $10 million in the bank from a venture capital firm. Knowing predictably, okay, we reached out to, whatever, 350 accounts in the last 2 weeks. We know that statistically that should turn into this many new co-hosts for these collective shows and this many traditional shows, 6 weeks from now, or whatever the case may be. Being able to have that level of granularity in your forecasting and reliability of your forecasting as we see these numbers play out, moving forward, I think Bill, our COO, is going to love it. But it gives me an enormous amount of peace as well.
Yeah, I love it, man. Well, hopefully this has been valuable for folks in just hearing us think through and share what we've been going through as we build out what is the anatomy, what is the math of sales for us, and how that affects, the other parts of the business. As you point out there with Bill, it helps, with planning, with staffing plans and all those sorts of things, especially if you are a bootstrap startup. So for folks who haven't gone through this exercise or have kind of let their metrics just kind of sit and they haven't evaluated them lately, I hope this is a little bit of encouragement to dive back into that, because I feel like it's been helpful for us.
Awesome. Sweet. Logan, you are all over Instagram these days at I am Logan Lyles. I am at James Carberry on Instagram. I've been up in my Instagram game as well. Instagram is a channel that we're starting to really go heavy on with the shows that we produce, with our collective shows that we mentioned. So Industrial Podcast, B2B sales show, B2B growth show even is starting to get really active on Instagram. So make sure to at least follow Logan and I. I am Logan Lyles at James Carberry on Instagram. We would love to connect with you there. See a little bit more behind the scenes. If you're listening to this episode and you enjoy hearing Logan and I talk about this kind of stuff, you'll see a lot more of it on Instagram. So Logan, man, thank you so much for dropping your brain on this episode and talking us through how you've reverse engineered these numbers, and really excited to do this again, man.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it. We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.